Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're going to dive into a gripping story of love, loyalty, and survival as we uncover whether Jack and Tu Tien can overcome the company's financial collapse after serious bridge construction violations left them unable to even pay the bank interest. Will love be enough to carry them through their darkest chapter? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. The house Jack had poured his heart into was finally finished. For weeks, maybe even months, that house had lived first in his mind, then on paper, then in the hands of workers, architects, and supervisors. And now, at last, it stood there, in real sunlight, solid, beautiful, warm, and full of the future he had wanted to build for Tu Tien and their little family. It was not just a house. To Jack, it was proof. Proof that after all the darkness, all the accusations, all the loss, all the nights when he thought life had taken too much from him, he could still build something good, something safe, something worthy of the woman who has stayed beside him through every storm. And to Tu Tien, the moment she first stepped fully inside and looked around without the noise of construction in the background, without dust, without half-finished corners, without the uncertainty of waiting, she felt something almost impossible to describe. It felt like peace had finally taken shape. Morning light spilled through the wide windows exactly the way Jack had promised it would. The kitchen was open and bright. The rooms felt spacious without losing warmth, and every detail somehow carried his presence. The little choices in the wood, the layout, the soft colors, the courtyard outside, even the baby's room, everything felt personal. Everything felt chosen with love. Tu Tien stood in the center of the main room with their son in her arms and slowly turned in a circle, taking it all in. For a few seconds she didn't speak. She just looked. Jack stood a short distance away, watching her face more closely than the house itself. "Well?" he asked, though his voice held the kind of careful nervousness that made her smile immediately. "Say something." Tu Tien turned toward him, and her eyes were already shining. "It feels like a dream." Jack let out a breath and laughed softly, the tension easing from his shoulders. "Good, I was hoping for something better than it's acceptable." He checked one side was still wet. Then the baby, startled by the sound, blinked and made a small noise in her arms. Jack walked over at once and reached out to stroke the child's cheek gently. "And what about you?" he asked the baby. "Do you approve of your father's work?" The baby waved one hand aimlessly, and Tu Tien smiled through the tears gathering in her eyes. "That's probably the highest compliment you're getting today." Jack looked up at her then, and for a moment neither of them said anything. They didn't need to, because both of them knew what this moment really meant. This was not only about a new house, it was about how far they had come. There had once been a time when they did not know if they would even get through the next week without another disaster. There had been fear, prison, hospitals, investigations, sleepless nights, pregnancy under pressure, and a child they nearly lost before he was even born. Back then, a bright and peaceful home like this would have sounded like something too distant to trust. But now it stood around them, real and whole, and it belonged to them. The housewarming day arrived not long after, and from early morning, the place was filled with life. Fresh flowers were arranged carefully in the front space. The courtyard had been cleaned until every corner felt ready to welcome joy. Food was prepared, drinks were set out, and there was a warm excitement in the air that made the house feel even more alive. Tu Tien moved through the rooms with a happiness she did not try to hide, though Jack kept reminding her not to do too much and to leave the heavier work to everyone else. "I'm serious," he told her for what felt like the 10th time that morning. "Today, you are not allowed to tire yourself out." Tu Tien adjusted the baby in her arms and gave him a look. "You've said that so many times, I'm starting to think you invited guests just so they could hear you repeat it." Jack looked completely unashamed. "Then they'll know I'm right." She smiled and shook her head, but secretly she loved him for it. As guests began arriving, the atmosphere shifted from warm anticipation to full celebration. Family came first, then close friends, then business partners, and after that, the kind of guests who would have seemed almost impossible in Jack's life not so long ago. Several owners and executives from major corporations came personally to congratulate him. Men who ran large construction groups, directors from powerful development companies, partners whose names carried weight in the industry. They stepped into Jack and Tu Tien's new home with gifts, smiles, handshakes, and respectful admiration. Some praised the house itself. Some praised Jack's recovery in business. Some spoke openly about how impressed they had been by the way he rebuilt his company after everything that had happened. And every time someone did, Jack accepted it politely. But his eyes often drifted back toward Tu Tien and their son, as if to remind himself what all of this had truly been for. At one point, one of the older corporate owners stood with a glass in hand, looking around the house with visible approval. "This," he said, turning to Jack, "is not just a successful housewarming. This is a man rebuilding his life properly." Several people nodded in agreement. Jack smiled lightly, but before he could answer, the older man added, "And you chose well, not just in business, in life." His gaze moved toward Tu Tien. She lowered her eyes slightly, smiling with quiet grace, while Jack's expression softened in a way that did not escape anyone watching closely. The guests stayed for hours. The conversations moved easily between personal congratulations and business respect. Some of the corporate leaders spoke with Jack about future cooperation. Others praised the quality of the completed major project that had elevated his company's name so dramatically. A few even joked that now Jack was becoming too important and would soon be too busy to invite ordinary people to events like this again. Jack laughed and answered smoothly. But every now and then, whenever the room grew full and noisy, he would look toward Tu Tien as if checking that she was all right, still comfortable, still smiling, still truly present in the happiness with him. She always was. Their son became the quiet center of the whole gathering. He was passed carefully from arm to arm among those close enough to hold him, admired endlessly, and praised in every way a baby can be praised. People commented on his bright eyes, his round cheeks, his calm expression, and the way he seemed strangely observant for such a small child. Jack, of course, accepted every compliment as if he had personally engineered perfection. Tu Tien caught him once adjusting the baby's blanket with absurd seriousness while two guests watched. "You look prouder than you did the day you signed that contract," she whispered when she came close enough. Jack didn't even deny it. That contract never smiled at me. By late afternoon, the sunlight had turned golden across the courtyard, casting the whole house in a softer glow. The guests were relaxed now, settled into the rhythm of the celebration, and the atmosphere had become something rare, elegant, joyful, intimate, and quietly unforgettable. It was during this moment, when the air felt warm and the voices around them had softened just enough, that Jack disappeared briefly from Tien's side. At first, she didn't think much of it. He had spent the whole day moving between guests, checking details, making sure everyone felt welcomed. But then she noticed something unusual. A few people were smiling in a way that suggested they knew something she didn't. One of the older women from the family gently touched Tu Tien's arm and said, "Just stand here for a moment." Tu Tien looked confused. "Why?" But before anyone answered, the sound in the room shifted, not louder, quieter. The kind of quiet that happens when attention begins gathering in one place all at once. Tu Tien turned, and there was Jack, standing just a few steps away. No papers in his hands, no business smile, no careful host expression. Only a look on his face she had never seen exactly this way before. Steady, open, almost trembling beneath its calm. For one brief second, her heart began beating faster, for no reason she could name. Then Jack took one slow step forward, then another, and suddenly the room around them seemed to fall away. Tu Tien tightened her hold on their son just slightly, her eyes never leaving Jack's face. Guests had gone silent now, watching with warm anticipation, some already smiling as if the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Jack stopped directly in front of her. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then, very gently, one of the women beside Tu Tien stepped forward and carefully took the baby into her arms. giving her a soft smile before moving away. Tu Tien barely noticed, because Jack was now lowering himself to one knee. The entire room seemed to breathe in at once. Tu Tien's eyes widened immediately, and one hand flew to her mouth before she could stop it. All the sound around her disappeared. She could no longer hear the voices, the movement, or even the soft music somewhere in the background. She could only see him. Jack, the man who had stood beside her through fire and ruin. The man who had nearly lost everything and still come back holding love in both hands. The man who had built this house for her, for their son, for the life they had fought so hard to keep. Now kneeling in front of her in the middle of the home he made with his whole heart. His voice when it came was low but clear enough for everyone to hear. Tu Tien, he said. There was a time when I thought life had already taken away my chance to give you the kind of future you deserved. By the time he said that much, her tears had already begun to fall. Jack continued, his eyes never leaving hers. But you stayed. You stayed through the worst days, through the fear, the shame, the pain, and the waiting. You gave me strength when I had none left. You gave me a son. You gave me a home before this house ever existed. He reached into his pocket, and when his hand came out again, there was a ring held carefully between his fingers. A soft sound moved through the gathered guests, but Tu Tien could barely hear it. Her whole body had gone still. So today, Jack said, his voice roughening with emotion, in front of the people who matter, in the home I built for us, I want to ask you properly. He lifted the ring slightly. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt how deeply you are loved? By then, Tu Tien was crying openly. Not quiet tears she tried to hide. Not controlled tears, the kind that come when joy arrives so suddenly and so fully that the heart cannot carry it in silence. She looked at him, then at the ring, then back at him again, almost as if she still could not believe the moment was real. Around them, everyone waited. The house was still. The golden evening light had turned everything warm, and in that suspended, beautiful instant, only one question remained alive in the air. Now that Jack and Tu Tien had finally come this far, would the wedding they both deserved truly happen? Or was life still holding one more twist between love and forever? For a few seconds after Jack asked the question, Tu Tien could not answer. She just stood there with tears falling down her face, one hand still covering her mouth, her whole body frozen in the middle of that beautiful, impossible moment. The room around them had gone completely quiet. Every guest was watching, but to Tu Tien, it no longer felt like anyone else was there. There was only Jack, kneeling in front of her, holding out the ring, looking at her with the kind of love that had already survived fire, ruin, fear, and time. Her chest rose and fell unevenly as she tried to catch her breath. For a second, all the memories came back at once. The days of hardship, the bridge collapse, the investigation, the nights of waiting, the loneliness, the fear of losing everything, the hospital, the baby. The way life had nearly crushed them more than once, and now here he was, asking her the one question she had dreamed of in silence, even when she no longer dared believe it would happen this way. Jack's voice came again, softer this time. Tu Tien. That finally pulled her back into the moment. She looked at him through her tears and let out a shaky laugh that sounded like joy breaking free all at once. Yes, she whispered. Then, because her voice was too soft and the tears kept getting in the way, she nodded quickly and said it again, louder this time. Yes, Jack, yes. The room erupted instantly. Applause, laughter, cheers, and warm voices filled the house all at once. Some of the guests clapped loudly. A few of the older women wiped tears from their eyes without any embarrassment. Even the business leaders who had come in formal suits and composed smiles were now laughing and congratulating them like family. But Jack heard almost none of it, because the moment she said yes, his whole face changed. Relief, gratitude, happiness, and something deeper than all of them at once passed across his expression so clearly, that Tu Tien nearly cried harder just watching him. Jack stood up slowly, his hands trembling just enough for her to notice, and slipped the ring onto her finger. The moment it settled there, he held her hand for one extra second, almost as if he needed to feel that it was real. Then he pulled her gently into his arms. Tu Tien held on to him tightly. The applause continued around them, but for a few seconds, all they could feel was each other. She pressed her face against his shoulder and laughed through tears. Jack closed his eyes and held her as if every difficult road in his life had somehow led only to that one embrace. When they finally pulled back, both of them were still smiling through emotion. "You surprised me," Tu Tien whispered. Jack gave the faintest laugh. "Good. I should have known something was happening. You did suspect. I did not suspect this. That's why it worked." That made her laugh again, and Jack reached up to wipe away the tears still clinging to her face. The tenderness of the gesture made several people around them react all over again with soft laughter and approving smiles. A moment later, the baby, who had been quietly watching the scene from another pair of arms without understanding anything, let out a small sound as if reminding everyone that he too was part of the event. The room immediately softened again. One of the older women carried him back over, smiling warmly. "He should be with his parents now," she said. Jack took his son carefully, then stood beside Tu Tien with the baby in one arm and the newly placed ring still shining on her hand. For a moment, the image was so complete that several guests began murmuring the same thing, in different ways. A real family, a beautiful beginning, a house full of blessing. The rest of the housewarming celebration changed after that. It was no longer just a gathering to celebrate a completed home or a successful company. It became something much deeper. A promise had been made inside that house, in front of people who had watched Jack, and Tu Tien survived things most couples never had to endure. And because of that, every congratulations that followed felt more personal, more emotional, and more meaningful. Some of the older guests came forward one by one to bless them. Some family members hugged Tu Tien and joked that she had waited long enough to hear that question properly. Others teased Jack for looking more nervous during the proposal than he had probably looked during million-dollar contract negotiations. One of the corporate directors laughed and said, "So this was the real major project today." Even Jack laughed at that. Later in the evening, after most of the formal congratulations had settled, the atmosphere turned softer again. The lights in the courtyard glowed warmly. The evening air was gentle. Their son had fallen asleep in Tu Tien's arms, completely unaware that one of the most important days of his parents' lives was unfolding around him. Jack stood beside her in the courtyard for a moment, away from the center of the conversation, and looked at her hand again. Tu Tien noticed. "You keep staring at it," she said. Jack smiled. "I waited a long time to see that ring there." She looked down too, then back at him. "I waited a long time too." For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Tu Tien asked a question that had quietly lived underneath all the joy since the moment he knelt. "Do you really think the wedding will happen smoothly?" Jack's expression softened, but he did not laugh the question away. He knew exactly why she asked. Because happiness had never come easily to them. Because every time life has seemed ready to open in front of them, something painful had tried to close it again. Because even now, after the house, the company, the baby, and the proposal, part of both of them still carried the habit of waiting for the next storm. Jack looked toward the baby sleeping in her arms, then back at her face. "I don't know what life will try," he said honestly. "I don't know if things will always go exactly the way we plan. But I do know this. We've already survived the kind of things that should have broken us." Tu Tien listened quietly. "And now," he continued, "we're not building from dreams anymore. We're building from truth, from everything we lived through, from everything we refused to let destroy us." Those words reached her more deeply than any easy promise could have, because that was the real difference now. Before, they had hope for happiness. Now, they had earned the right to believe in it. As the guests slowly began to leave, the of blessings and good wishes continued all the way to the gate. Some promised to attend the wedding no matter how busy they were. Some jokingly warned Jack not to delay anything now that he had already proposed, in front of so many witnesses. A few of the corporate guests even said they had not expected a housewarming event to end with something that felt so unforgettable. By the time the house grew quieter again, the night had deepened. The flowers were still fresh. The warm lights still glowed softly. The air carried the fading traces of celebration, and for the first time that day, it was just the three of them again. Tu Tien sat down carefully with the baby asleep against her shoulder, while Jack lowered himself beside her and let out a long, quiet breath. "Tired?" she asked. Jack smiled faintly. "Very." "Happy?" He looked at her, then at the ring, then at the sleeping son. "More than I know how to say." Tu Tien leaned gently against him. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the soft sounds of the house around them. No accusations, no legal threats, no fear pressing against the windows. Only the peace of a home finally filled with joy. Then Jack turned slightly toward her and asked, "Are you afraid?" Tu Tien considered the question carefully before answering. "A little," she admitted. "Not because I doubt you, not because I doubt us, just because life, has taught me not to take beautiful things lightly." Jack nodded. Then he reached for her hand and held it, the ring cool and real between his fingers. "That's okay," he said. "We don't have to be fearless. We just have to keep going." Tu Tien smiled softly at that, because that had always been the truth of them. Not that they were stronger than pain, not that they were luckier than others, only that every time life pushed them down somehow, they still found a way to keep walking toward each other. Their son stirred slightly in his sleep, and both of them looked down at him at the same moment. That small shared movement made them laugh quietly. Jack leaned closer and kissed Tu Tien's forehead. "The wedding will happen," he said softly. This time there was no hesitation in his voice, not arrogance, not blind certainty, just the calm strength of a man who had finally decided to trust happiness enough to build it with his own hands. Tu Tien looked at him for a long second, then nodded. And as the night wrapped gently around their new home, only one truth remained stronger than every question that had once haunted them. Whatever challenge might still come, Jack and Tu Tien were no longer waiting to be saved by life. They were already creating the life they wanted. And this time, they were going to fight to keep it.